To understand the silence that was coming, one must first understand the noise. If you were to stand on the corner of Broadway and Fulton Street in New York City in the autumn of 1872, the first thing that would assault you would not be the sights, but the sound. It was a roar, a chaotic, deafening, organic symphony that never truly slept. It was the sound of iron striking granite. Thousands of metal shoes hammering against cobblestones, a staccato rhythm that echoed off the rising brick facades of the metropolis. It was the squeal of wooden wheels on iron rails, the crack of leather whips, the straining grunts of heavy beasts, and the shouting of teamsters. This was the heartbeat of the 19th century city. It was the sound of a civilization that ran entirely and exclusively on the muscle of the horse. We look back at this era through the lens of history books that label it the Age of Steam. We see the black and white photographs of locomotives bellowing smoke and factory chimneys darkening the sky, and we assume that the Industrial Revolution was a triumph of the machine over the animal. But this is a fundamental misconception. Civilization in 1872 did not run on steam. It ran on oats. It ran on hay. It ran on the sweating, straining, living backs of the horse. The steam engine had not replaced the horse, it had merely fed it. The locomotives that crisscrossed the continent brought more goods to the cities, more cotton, more coal, more timber, and more grain than ever before. But once those goods arrived at the depot, the train stopped. The steam engine was bound to its tracks. It could not turn a corner. It could not back into a warehouse. It could not deliver a ton of coal to a basement on Fifth Avenue. For the last mile of every single transaction in the global economy, the world relied on the horse. Without the horse, the railroad was a bridge to nowhere. The Industrial Revolution had actually created a paradox. The more mechanized the world became, the more horses it needed to service the machines. By 1872, the horse population of the United States was exploding. There were an estimated 7 million horses in the country, roughly 1 for every 5 humans. But these animals were not evenly distributed across the pastoral landscapes of the West. They were concentrated with suffocating density in the industrial cities of the East. New York City alone housed over 130,000 horses. Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and Baltimore were similarly packed. These were not cities designed for the automobile. They were cities built by and for the horse. They lived among us in a way that is incomprehensible to the modern mind. Today, we view horses as luxury animals, inhabitants of green pastures and hobby farms. In 1872, they were the blue-collar workforce. They were residents of the city, living in multi-story brick stables in the financial districts, in the dank basements of tenement buildings, and in the alleys behind five-star hotels. A single streetcar line in Manhattan might own 2,000 horses to keep their cars moving 24 hours a day. The urban infrastructure was a vertical integration of human and animal life. The logistics of keeping this biological fleet alive were a miracle of unplanned economics. The horse was a machine that required fuel. Every single day, New York City had to import nearly 1 million pounds of hay and oats. A ceaseless river of barges and freight cars flowed into the city just to keep the engines running. And like any engine, the horse produced exhaust. The great manure crisis of the late 19th century was not a joke. It was a public health emergency. A healthy draft horse produces between 15 and 30 pounds of manure a day. Multiply that by 130,000 in the confined space of Manhattan, and you are dealing with millions of pounds of biological waste dropped directly onto the streets every 24 hours. In the summer, This waste dried into a fine, fecal dust that coated the inside of lungs and settled on food. In the rain, it turned the boulevards into swamps of toxic sludge. It was the smell of the century, the inescapable, pungent aroma of progress. This was the ecosystem of 1872. It was a symbiotic relationship between man and beast that had existed for thousands of years, but it had been scaled up to an industrial nightmare. We had built our entire society on the back of a single biological platform. There was a rigid hierarchy to this world, a caste system of the equine. At the top were the private carriage horses of the elite, the Vanderbilts and the Astors. These were sleek, well-fed animals, groomed to perfection, their coats glistening as they trotted through Central Park. Below them were the saddle horses and the trotters, the animals of leisure and sport. But these were the minority. The vast majority of the urban horse population were the laborers. There were the dray horses, the massive Clydesdales and Percherons that hauled the beer wagons and the iron beams. There were the delivery ponies that trotted frantically to bring milk and mail. And at the very bottom of the social ladder were the streetcar horses. The streetcar horse was the disposable unit of the 19th century transit system. These animals worked brutal shifts, stopping and starting heavy cars laden with passengers hundreds of times a day. The strain on their hocks and tendons was immense. They were whipped to maintain schedules, working on cobblestones that shattered their legs. The average career of a streetcar horse lasted less than 4 years. Transit companies calculated the depreciation of a horse just as they calculated the wear on the iron rails. If a horse broke down, it was sold to the knackery for glue and leather, and a new one was purchased the next day. It was a cold, unsentimental business. This brutality had sparked a movement. In 1866, a wealthy diplomat named Henry Bergh had founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, ASPCA, in New York, largely because he was horrified by the treatment of these urban workers. Bergh would famously stand in the middle of traffic, raising his cane to stop drivers from beating their overloaded animals. He was ridiculed by many as a sentimental eccentric, a man interfering with the gears of commerce. But Bergh understood something that the captains of industry did not. The system was pushing these animals to their breaking point. The dependency went deeper than just economics. It was a matter of life and death. If your house caught fire in 1872, you prayed for the horses. The steam pumpers used by the fire departments weighed thousands of pounds. Men could not pull them fast enough to save a burning building. Only a team of 3 powerful horses, trained to rush into the harness at the sound of a bell, could get the water to the fire in time. If you fell sick, the ambulance was horse-drawn. If you died, the hearse was horse-drawn. From the cradle to the grave, human life was bracketed by the sound of hooves. As the autumn of 1872 approached, the United States was in a mood of aggressive optimism. The Civil War had been over for 7 years, and the scars were beginning to fade. Ulysses S. Grant was in the White House, campaigning for a second term. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished, binding the nation together with iron bands. The stock market was volatile but active, fueled by railroad speculation. The harvest was expected to be good. In the stables of North America, millions of animals stood in their stalls, chewing their oats, breathing the same air, sharing the same water troughs. They were the invisible infrastructure. We walked past them without seeing them. We assumed they would always be there, just as we assume the electricity will always turn on when we flip a switch. But the biology of the stable was a ticking time bomb. The urban stable was the perfect petri dish for a plague. You had high density, poor ventilation, immense physical stress, and communal points of contact. Water troughs in city squares acted like office water coolers, but for exchanging viruses. Every horse from every neighborhood dipped their nose into the same stagnant water, sharing fluids with hundreds of strangers. The interconnectedness of the continent, the great triumph of the age, was about to become its undoing. The rails that carried the mail could carry a virus. The canal boats that carried the coal could carry the plague. The world had built a superhighway for disease, and it didn't even know it. The financiers on Wall Street were worried about gold prices and tariffs. The politicians were worried about reconstruction and scandal. No one was looking at the horses. No one was factoring equine influenza into their risk assessments. They had forgotten the biological baseline of their wealth. They had forgotten that their gleaming modern industrial cities were, at their core, powered by breath and blood. The engine of the 19th century was running at full capacity, redlining in the pursuit of profit. It was a monoculture of transportation, a system with zero redundancy. If the horse stopped, the city stopped. If the horse died, the city died. And in the quiet, cooling air of late September, far to the north, the engine began to cough. The end of the world, for the horse, did not begin in a teeming metropolis. It did not begin in the filth-choked alleys of Five Points in New York, or the industrial slaughterhouses of Chicago. The catastrophe that would bring the North American economy to its knees began in a place of deceptive tranquility. It began in the rolling autumnal pastures of Lowville, Ontario, a small village roughly 30 miles southwest of Toronto. The date was late September 1872. The exact day is lost to the fog of history, largely because the event itself seemed so unremarkable at the time. A horse coughed. In the 19th century, a coughing horse was as common as a squeaking hinge. These animals lived their lives in drafty barns, pulling heavy loads through rain and sleet. They suffered from strangles, heaves, and common colds with regularity. When Mr. W.C. Brown, a local owner in Lowville, noticed two of his geldings acting lethargic and refusing their evening oats, he likely felt nothing more than a flicker of annoyance. A sick horse meant a loss of labor. It was an inconvenience, not a harbinger of doom. But this cough was different. It was deep, dry, and hacking, a sound that seemed to scrape the very lining of the animal's throat. Within 24 hours, the cough was accompanied by a terrifying swiftness of symptom progression. The horses' coats turned dull and staring. Their ears drooped. Their eyes became glassy and watery. But most alarming was the discharge. A thin, watery fluid began to drip from their nostrils, quickly thickening into a yellow, mucopurulent slime that clogged their airways and left the animals gasping for oxygen. Brown called for the local farrier, but by the time help arrived, the sickness had already jumped. It wasn't just two horses anymore. It was the entire barn. This is the terrifying mathematics of the naive host. The horses of North America had no biological memory of this specific influenza strain. Their immune systems were blank slates. When a virus enters a population with zero immunity, it does not encounter friction. It encounters an open highway. The transmission rate in that first barn in Lowville approached 100%. If you breathed the air, you caught the disease. The virus, now known to modern science as a strain of equine influenza A, possessed a wicked volatility. It traveled on the breath. A single sneeze from an infected draft horse could atomize the virus into millions of microscopic droplets, suspending them in the still air of a stable. In the 19th century, ventilation was an afterthought. Barns were built to keep heat in, which meant they were perfectly designed incubators. The air in Mr. Brown's stable became a viral soup. Had the outbreak stayed in Lowville, it might have burned itself out. It might have been remembered as a local tragedy, a bad autumn for the farmers of Halton County. But 1872 was not a time of isolation. It was an era of kinetic connectivity. Lowville was a feeder vein for the great artery of Toronto. Farmers brought their produce to the city. Drovers moved livestock to the railheads. The virus hitched a ride. It likely traveled in the respiratory tract of a carriage horse, appearing healthy but already shedding the pathogen, making the 30-mile journey south to the provincial capital. On October 1st, 1872, the disease made its debut in Toronto. If Lowville was the spark, Toronto was the powder keg. Toronto in the 1870s was a city of density. It was the commercial hub of Upper Canada, a bustling nexus of brickworks, distilleries, and rail yards. And everywhere, there were horses. They were packed into the livery stables on King Street. They were jammed into the streetcar depots on Yonge Street. The concept of social distancing did not exist for humans, let alone for their beasts of burden. The arrival of the virus in the city was explosive. Andrew Smith, the chief veterinarian at the Ontario Veterinary College and the most respected animal doctor in the Dominion, was one of the first to witness the phenomenon. He later described the onset as sudden and universal. It didn't move from stable to stable in a linear line. It seemed to erupt everywhere at once, carried by the wind and the ceaseless traffic of the streets. The epicenter of the urban outbreak became the stables of the Toronto Street Railway Company. These were industrial barracks for horses, housing hundreds of animals in close quarters. The streetcar horses were the consummate proletarians of the equine world. They worked hard, breathed deep, and shared communal water troughs. By October 3rd, just days after the first case was noted, the managers of the Street Railway Company faced a nightmare. A few horses were coughing in the morning. By noon, dozens were too weak to stand. By evening, the entire fleet was effectively crippled. The sound of Toronto changed overnight. The rhythmic rumble of the streetcars, the heartbeat of the city's transit, began to falter. Schedules were slashed. Cars sat abandoned in the depots. Commuters, confused and annoyed, found themselves waiting on street corners for rides that would never come. The public reaction in those first days of October was a mix of confusion and dangerous nonchalance. The newspapers treated the outbreak with a detached curiosity. The Globe reported on the prevailing distemper, assuring readers that while the disease was widespread, fatalities were low. This was technically true. The mortality rate was hovering around 1 or 2%, but it missed the point entirely. The danger of this flu was not that it killed the horse, but that it incapacitated the horse. A dead horse is a tragedy. A sick horse is a logistical crisis. A dead horse can be replaced. A sick horse requires care, food, water, and nursing, yet it produces no work. And because the disease was so contagious, you couldn't just bring in replacements. Any new horse brought into an infected stable would catch the virus within hours. The labor supply wasn't just damaged, it was evaporating. Inside the stables, the scene was dantesque. The sound of coughing was deafening, a chorus of deep, rattling hacks that shook the wooden frames of the barns. The animals stood with their heads hanging low, too weak to eat the oats in their mangers. Their eyes were swollen shut. Fever ravaged their bodies, spiking their temperatures to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Stable hands, overwhelmed and underpaid, waded through the muck, trying to sponge the feverish animals with cold water, trying to clear the mucus from their nostrils so they wouldn't suffocate. The treatments available were primitive, born of a veterinary science that was still straddling the line between medieval alchemy and modern medicine. Desperate owners turned to folk remedies. They burned tar and feathers in the stables, filling the air with acrid smoke in the mistaken belief that it would purify the miasma. They bled the horses, weakening them further. They force-fed them mixtures of gin, ginger, and aconite. Dr. Smith and his colleagues at the veterinary college pleaded for a more rational approach. Rest, warmth, and fresh air. Do not work the horse, Smith warned. If you work them while they are sick, you will kill them. This advice, however, collided head-on with the economic reality of the 19th century. For a carter or a delivery man, a horse that didn't work meant a family that didn't eat. There was no sick pay for animals. And so, many owners, driven by desperation or greed, harnessed their coughing, feverish beasts and forced them out into the cold October rain. The results were horrifying. Horses would collapse in the middle of Yonge Street, dying not from the flu itself, but from heart failure brought on by exertion. Passers-by would stop and stare at the fallen giants, watching as the animals gasped their last breaths on the cobblestones. It was the first visual shock of the epidemic, the moment when the abstract distemper became a visceral reality on the public thoroughfare. By the second week of October, Toronto was effectively under siege. The disease had a name now. The papers called it the Canadian horse disease, or the Epizootic catarrh. The word epizootic, from the Greek epi, upon, and zoon, animal, began to appear in headlines. It was the animal equivalent of an epidemic, and it was sweeping through the province with the speed of a prairie fire. It moved along the corridors of commerce. It traveled with the mail coaches to Hamilton. It rode the canal barges to Ottawa.
It followed the Grand Trunk Railway to Montreal.
The speed of the spread was the most terrifying aspect for those paying attention. In previous centuries, a disease moved at the speed of a walking animal. But in 1872, the horse was integrated into a mechanized transport network. A racehorse could be loaded onto a train in Toronto and unloaded in Detroit the same day. The railroad, the great symbol of industrial progress, became the super vector for the biological plague. As the middle of October approached, the virus reached the edges of the Dominion. It stood at the Niagara frontier. It stood at the Detroit River. It stood at the border of the United States. On the American side, the reaction was still one of bemusement. The New York Times ran brief blurbs about the equine difficulties of their northern neighbors. There was a sense of detachment, a belief that national borders were impermeable barriers. American horse owners looked at their healthy stock and felt a false sense of security. They did not understand that the microbial world does not respect lines drawn on a map. The telegrams began to fly between Canadian and American veterinarians. "Prepare yourselves," the Canadians warned. It is coming. But how do you prepare for a wind that carries sickness? How do you quarantine an economy that runs on movement? The U.S. customs officials at Niagara Falls watched the trains crossing the suspension bridge. They saw the cattle cars and the horse boxes. They saw the commerce flowing freely, unaware that inside those wooden cars, the breath of the infected was mixing with the breath of the healthy. The incubation period was short, sometimes as little as 3 days. This meant that a horse could board a train in Toronto, appearing perfectly healthy, its coat shining, its eyes bright. It could cross the border, be unloaded in a stable in Buffalo or Rochester, and be rubbed down by a groom. It could drink from a trough shared by 50 other horses. And only then, 2 days later, would the first cough be heard. By then, it was already too late. The Trojan horse had already opened its gates. Back in Toronto, the peak of the wave was crashing. The city was paralyzed. The streetcars had stopped completely. Delivery wagons were scarce. The price of coal delivery skyrocketed because there were no horses to haul it. The silent street phenomenon began to take hold. A strange acoustic dampening of the city as the clatter of hooves vanished. But for the United States, the silence was still just a rumor. The noise of American commerce was as loud as ever. The great dray horses of New York were still hauling their loads. The fire horses of Boston were still racing to blazes. The canal mules of the Erie Canal were still plodding along the towpaths. They did not know that the clock was ticking. They did not know that patient zero had arguably already arrived, invisible and silent, standing in a stall in a border town, waiting for the fever to revisit.
Break. The Canadian genesis was complete. The incubator of the North had done its work. The virus had mutated, multiplied, and mastered its host. Now it turned its gaze south, toward the millions of naive, unsuspecting horses that powered the rising industrial giant of America. The invasion was about to begin. The invasion of the United States did not begin with a cannon shot, nor with the tramping of boots. It began with the huffing of steam and the clattering of hooves on a wooden deck suspended over a churning gorge. The Niagara Railway Suspension Bridge was, in 1872, a marvel of the modern world. It was a spiderweb of iron and oak spanning the Niagara River, the physical umbilical cord connecting the Dominion of Canada to the state of New York. It was the choke point of international trade, a funnel through which the wealth of two nations flowed. And in October of that year, it became the primary injection point for a biological catastrophe. Every day, trains loaded with livestock rumbled across the bridge. Cattle from the Ontario heartland, horses bred for the carriage trade, and draft animals destined for the canal towpaths of the American East. The customs agents stationed at the border were looking for contraband. They were looking for undeclared goods, for fugitives, for taxable commodities. They were not looking for slightly glazing eyes or the subtle, rhythmic flaring of nostrils that indicated respiratory distress. The virus crossed the border in the lungs of asymptomatic carriers. These were horses that had been exposed in the saturated air of Toronto stables only days prior. They appeared healthy. They moved with vigor. But deep within their respiratory tracts, the influenza virus was replicating with exponential ferocity. As these animals were unloaded in the rail yards of Buffalo and Detroit, they exhaled the plague into a new, naive ecosystem. The spread of the great Epizootic of 1872 offers a fascinating, if terrifying, case study in the history of epidemiology because it was the first true railroad epidemic. In previous centuries, a disease affecting livestock was limited by the speed of the animal itself. A sick horse walks slowly. If a horse in the 1700s contracted a virus, it might walk 10 miles in a day, perhaps infecting a few barns along a dirt road. The disease moved at the speed of biological life, 4 miles per hour. But in 1872, the horse had been decoupled from its own biology. It was no longer limited by its legs. A horse could be loaded onto a boxcar in Toronto at noon, travel at 30 miles per hour, and arrive in a crowded distribution center in New York State by evening. The railroad acted as a biological superconductor. It allowed the virus to jump hundreds of miles in a single bound, leapfrogging rural areas to strike directly at the dense urban centers where it could do the most damage. The first alarms in the United States rang out in the border cities. In Buffalo, the great terminus of the Erie Canal, the symptoms appeared almost immediately after the arrival of Canadian stock. The canal mules, the tough, obstinate engines of the waterway, began to cough. To understand the severity of this, one must understand the importance of Buffalo. It was the hinge of the American grain trade. The harvest of the Midwest flowed to Buffalo by lake steamer, was transferred to canal boats, and pulled by mules 360 miles to the Hudson River and down to New York City. If Buffalo stopped, the breadbasket of the nation was sealed shut. By mid-October, the stables of Buffalo were echoing with the same dry, hacking cough that had silenced Toronto. But unlike the Canadians, who had watched the storm gather slowly, the Americans were blindsided. The incubation period had been burned up during the transit. The disease arrived fully formed and aggressive. Simultaneously, the virus struck Detroit. The ferry boats crossing the river brought infected drays into the heart of Michigan's commercial hub. Within 48 hours of the first case, the Detroit Free Press reported that the disease was raging with a violence unknown in the annals of the veterinary art. The speed of the collapse in these frontier cities was startling. In Detroit, the streetcar system didn't just slow down, it evaporated. On October 13th, the cars were running. On October 14th, the company announced a suspension of service. The horses were simply too sick to stand. It was here, in the middle of October, that the telegram panic began. The electric telegraph, the nervous system of the nation, began to pulse with frantic messages. Stable owners in Buffalo wired their counterparts in Rochester. Disease here, heavy losses, isolate your stock. Rochester wired Syracuse. Syracuse wired Albany. For the first time in history, the news of a plague traveled faster than the plague itself, but only just. The newspaper editors in New York City and Boston sat in their smoke-filled offices, reading the wire reports with a mixture of skepticism and dread. The reports were apocalyptic. They spoke of streets empty of traffic, of commerce grinding to a halt, of a universal sickness that spared no animal. To the sophisticated urbanites of the East Coast, these reports sounded like exaggeration. There was a prevailing sense of American exceptionalism that bordered on delusion. The New York Herald initially dismissed the reports as hysteria, suggesting that the Canadian horses were simply malnourished or ill-kept. Our American stock, the reasoning went, is superior. Our stables are better ventilated. Our feed is purer. This hubris was dismantled mile by mile, hour by hour. The virus moved down the Erie Canal corridor like a flame following a fuse. It hit Rochester on October 17th. It hit Syracuse on the 18th. It wasn't drifting, it was marching. It moved eastward at a pace of roughly 40 miles a day, the exact average speed of a freight train and a canal packet, boat combined.
The transmission dynamics were brutal. As the canal boats moved east, the sick mules would breathe on the healthy teams passing in the opposite direction on the narrow towpaths. The communal stables at the locks, where teams were swapped out for rest, became viral distribution centers. Every time a team stopped for water or oats, they picked up the infection and carried it to the next town. By the third week of October, the invasion force was no longer on the frontier. It was in the Hudson Valley. It was knocking on the door of the metropolis. The psychological atmosphere in the United States began to shift from curiosity to genuine fear. The horse was not just a tool. It was the mechanism of fire safety, food delivery, and basic sanitation. The realization began to dawn on the mayors and city councils of the East. If the horses stop, the city becomes a trap. In Albany, the state capital, the delivery of goods ceased. The streets filled with men pulling handcarts, a humiliating regression that foreshadowed what was coming for the rest of the nation. But all eyes were fixed on the great prize, the center of gravity of the Western Hemisphere, New York City. New York was the ultimate target. It was the densest concentration of equine life on the planet. It was a city where 130,000 horses lived in a space of a few square miles. The experts knew that if the spark reached that combustible pile of biological fuel, the resulting fire would be uncontrollable. On or about October 21st, the inevitable occurred. The exact moment is unrecorded, but the mechanism is easy to surmise. A train from upstate rolled into the vast rail yards of the New York Central Railroad on the west side of Manhattan. The doors of a cattle car slid open. A team of horses, perhaps tired from the journey, perhaps coughing slightly, was led down the ramp and into the teeming streets of the city. They were led to a stable. They drank from a trough. They breathed the air of the city. The invasion was successful. The enemy was inside the gates. The great Epizootic had arrived in the capital of the world. And the city of New York, deafened by its own noise and blinded by its own ambition, did not yet know that it was about to be silenced. The infection of New York City did not happen linearly. It happened geometrically. If the spread across the countryside had been a marching army, the outbreak in Manhattan was a bomb detonating in a confined room. On October 22, 1872, a ripple of unease passed through the immense livery stables of the West Side. A few dozen horses were reported sick. The symptoms were the same as those in Canada: the hacking cough, the lethargy, the terrifying discharge. But in the dense, vertical architecture of New York, the transmission dynamics were fundamentally different. New York City in the Gilded Age was a nightmare of overcrowding, not just for people, but for animals. Real estate was at a premium. Unlike the spacious, airy barns of the countryside, the city horse lived in conditions that were barely indistinguishable from a dungeon. Tens of thousands of animals were housed in cellars, deep underground, where sunlight never penetrated and air stagnated in heavy, humid pockets. Others were kept in multi-story brick tenements, walked up and down ramps to stalls packed so tightly that a horse could barely lie down. These stables were efficiently designed for one thing: storing the maximum amount of biological energy in the minimum amount of space. But in October 1872, they transformed into high-efficiency viral reactors. Dr. Alexandre Lyotard, a French-born veterinarian and one of the few men of science in the city who truly understood the gravity of the situation,
watched the catastrophe unfold with professional horror. He noted that once the virus entered a stable, it didn't pick and choose. It took everything. In a stable of 300 horses, 290 would be symptomatic within 48 hours. By October 23rd, the whisper became a shout. The disease jumped from the private stables to the great public arteries. The streetcar companies, the lifeblood of the city's transit, began to report massive casualties. The 3rd Avenue line, the 2nd Avenue line, the Broadway Stage Company, all of them saw their motive power collapsing in the stalls. Then came the exponential curve. On Wednesday, October 23rd, there were perhaps a few thousand sick horses in the city. By Friday, October 25th, the estimate was 30,000. By the weekend, it was nearly impossible to find a healthy horse on the island of Manhattan. The speed of the incapacitation left the city's management reeling. There was no time to organize a contingency plan. There was no time to stockpile supplies. One day the city was moving. The next, it was paralyzed. The defining characteristic of this phase of the disaster was not the chaos of the sick animals, but the change in the city's atmosphere. It was the onset of the Great Silence. For decades, New York had been the loudest place on earth. It was defined by the roar, a constant thundering background radiation of iron shoes on stone. It was a noise so pervasive that New Yorkers claimed they couldn't sleep without it. It was the sound of commerce, of motion, of life itself. On October 26, 1872, the roar stopped. It didn't fade away gradually. It was severed. As the streetcar companies suspended service and the trucking firms locked their stable doors, the traffic vanished. The effect was disorienting, almost hallucinogenic. Accounts from the time describe a city that had suddenly been wrapped in wool. Broadway, usually a river of gridlock so dense that pedestrians had to dodge death to cross it, became a vast, empty canyon of cobblestones. The only sound remaining was the shuffling of human feet. Journalists walked down the center of Fifth Avenue, notebooks in hand, marveling at the acoustic void. They compared it to a permanent Sunday, a Sabbath that lasted all week. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of a day of rest. It was the eerie, heavy silence of a ghost town. The buildings were there, the people were there, but the energy was gone. The kinetic force that drove the metropolis had been unplugged. The visual landscape of the city changed instantly. The manure, which usually coated the streets in a layer of filth, dried up and blew away, leaving the stones strangely clean. The sparrows of the street, the thousands of birds that fed on the undigested oats in the horse droppings, began to starve. They swarmed the gutters, chirping frantically, looking for a food source that had ceased to exist. But the silence was deceptive. Behind the closed doors of the stables, a tragedy of immense proportions was unfolding. The city didn't hear the hooves, but if one walked past a livery barn, they heard the sound of mass suffering. The coughing was continuous. It echoed from the basements and the alleyways, a collective rasping of tens of thousands of lungs struggling for air. The cruelty of the situation lay in the economics. A sick horse needs rest, but a city needs to eat. As the days dragged on, the desperation of the human population began to mount. The supply chain had snapped. New York City lived on a just-in-time delivery system long before the term was invented. Fresh milk, vegetables, ice, and coal arrived daily. When the horses stopped, the deliveries stopped. The scene at the docks was apocalyptic. The great ocean liners from Europe and the coasting schooners from the south continued to arrive in New York Harbor, driven by wind and steam. They docked at the piers along the Hudson and East Rivers, their holds bursting with cargo. Crates of lemons from the Mediterranean, barrels of sugar from the Caribbean, bales of cotton from the south, and there they sat. There were no drays to move the goods from the ship to the warehouse. The piers became choked with rotting merchandise. The captains of the ships raged and paced their decks, looking out at a city that seemed to be under a spell. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean only to be defeated by the last 100 yards. The ghost ships of October became a symbol of the crisis. They were monuments to the fragility of industrial civilization. The most advanced steam technology in the world was rendered useless because the primitive biological link in the chain, the horse, had failed. The impact rippled into the domestic sphere. The coal panic began to set in. October was turning cold, and New York was heated almost entirely by coal. The coal arrived at the rail depots and the docks, but it needed to be carted to the brownstones and tenements. With the coal carts grounded, the price of fuel skyrocketed. The poor began to scavenge for wood, eyeing the fences and the furniture. The specter of a freezing winter hung over the city. In the commercial districts, the panic turned into a strange, improvised comedy. Merchants, realizing they could not move their goods, tried to hire anything that could walk. Oxen were brought in from the countryside, lumbering slowly down Broadway, looking bewildered by the skyscrapers. Goats were harnessed to small carts. Dogs were pressed into service. But these were novelties, insufficient to move the millions of tons of freight required to keep the city alive. The paralysis exposed the class divide of the equine world. The wealthy, whose carriage horses were kept in pristine, well-ventilated stables near Central Park, found their animals were often the last to succumb. But the working-class horses, the omnibus pullers, the cart horses, the beasts that lived in the filth, went down first and hardest. The owners of these working animals faced a terrible choice. If they didn't work, they went bankrupt. The pressure to force sick horses back into the harness was immense. It was here that Henry Bergh, the great meddler of the ASPCA, stepped into the light. He mobilized his agents, stationing them at key intersections across Manhattan. They were given simple orders. If you see a sick horse being worked, stop the driver. If he refuses to unhitch, arrest him. Bergh became the general of a war against greed. He physically blocked streetcars that tried to run with coughing teams. He raided delivery companies, forcing them to unhitch feverish animals. The newspapers, which had previously mocked him, now hailed him as the conscience of the city. He was the only line of defense between the suffering animals and the crushing wheels of commerce. But even Bergh couldn't stop the inevitable. As the week ended, New York City was a place of suspended animation. The post office stopped delivering mail. The garbage piled up on the curbs. The fire department, terrified of a conflagration they couldn't reach, put the city on high alert. The great silencing was absolute. The hub of the Western Hemisphere, the engine of American capitalism, had been turned off. The city had been reminded, in the most brutal way possible, that it was not a machine. It was a biological entity, and it was sick. And as the citizens of New York looked out their windows at the empty, silent streets, a new realization took hold. They couldn't wait for the horses to recover. They couldn't wait for the fever to break. If the horses wouldn't pull the wagons, the men would have to do it themselves. The age of the man-horse was about to begin. By the final week of October 1872, the paralysis of New York City had shifted from a momentary crisis to a siege condition. The novelty of the silence had worn off, replaced by a gnawing economic anxiety. The city was a digestive system that had stopped metabolizing. Goods were rotting on the piers. Coal was stockpiling in the rail yards. The mail was gathering dust in the distribution centers. The realization settled over the populace like a cold fog. The horses were not going to wake up cured on Monday morning. It was in this vacuum of motive power that a strange and desperate transformation began to take hold.
If the biological engine of the horse had failed, the city would have to revert to the only other engine available: the human body. Monday, October 28th, witnessed the dawn of the man-horse. It began sporadically, a few isolated acts of necessity. A grocer in the Lower East Side, desperate to restock his shelves, strapped a leather belt across his chest, tied it to a handcart, and began to pull. A father, unable to find a cab to take his sick child to the doctor, pulled a small wagon through the empty avenues. But as the sun rose higher, the improvisation organized itself into a system. The streets of Manhattan, which had been swept clean of equine traffic, began to fill with a new, bizarre pageantry. Men, stripping off their jackets and rolling up their sleeves, stepped between the shafts of carts that had been designed for animals 5 times their weight. The physics of this substitution were punishing. A standard urban dray horse in 1872 weighed between 1,400 and 1,800 pounds. It was a creature of immense torque, evolved to lean into a collar and move loads that defied human musculature. A man, by comparison, was a frail engine. It took 4, 5, sometimes 10 men to do the work of a single horse. The great express companies, Adams Express, Wells Fargo, the United States Express Company, were the first to industrialize this desperation. They could not afford to stop. Their business was speed and reliability. If they couldn't deliver the packages, they violated their contracts. And so they turned to their workforce. Teams of clerks, drivers, and warehouse porters were assembled into human gangs. They constructed custom harnesses, loops of rope or leather straps that went over the shoulders and across the chests of the men. They lined up in teams of 4 or 6, hitched themselves to the heavy delivery wagons, and set off. The spectacle was greeted with a mixture of cheers, jeers, and dark humor. The American spirit, ever resilient and prone to irony, turned the disaster into a piece of performance art. The men in the harnesses began to adopt the personas of the animals they were replacing. They gave themselves names. One man would be Boxer, another Vixen, another Thunder. As they strained against the load, pulling heavy crates of dry goods up the gentle slope of Broadway, they would snort, whinny, and shy at pieces of paper blowing in the wind. Crowds gathered on the sidewalks to watch these human teams. When a team of clerks from a dry goods firm managed to get a heavy wagon moving, the onlookers would applaud. Street urchins ran alongside, cracking imaginary whips and shouting, "Giddy up!" The workers played along, snapping at the air and pretending to bite each other. It was a coping mechanism, a way to laugh into the abyss. But beneath the laughter was a humiliation and a physical toll that was anything but funny. The work was grueling. Men collapsed in the traces, their boots slipping on the cobblestones, their chests heaving. The sheer friction of the iron-rimmed wheels was a constant enemy. The post office department faced perhaps the most critical challenge. In 1872, the mail was the internet. It was the only way business was transacted, the only way news traveled, the only way lovers communicated. A delay in the mail was not an inconvenience. It was a systemic failure of society. The New York post office was overwhelmed. The mails from Europe continued to arrive by steamship, but the distribution network had collapsed. In a desperate bid to clear the backlog, the postmaster authorized the hiring of human mules. Large gangs of laborers, many of them unemployed immigrants from the docks, were hired to pull the mail wagons.
The sight of the U.S. mail being dragged by sweating, cursing men became one of the defining images of the Epizootic. It represented the regression of civilization. The most advanced republic on Earth, the beacon of the future, had been reduced to the technology of ancient Egypt, human beings acting as beasts of burden. But there was a darker calculus at play. As the week wore on, the novelty of the volunteer spirit faded, replaced by the cold, hard logic of the labor market. The price of a horse had been high, the price of a man was low. With the harbor locked up, thousands of longshoremen and dock workers were out of work. They were desperate for a wage. The trucking companies and merchants realized they had a surplus of cheap energy waiting on the street corners. Men were hired for $1 a day to pull carts until they dropped. It was a grim illustration of the Gilded Age's economic hierarchy. When the valuable property, the horse, was sick, the expendable property, the poor, was hitched to the wagon. The most terrifying manifestation of the man-horse era occurred in the fire departments. The steam fire engines of the 1870s were monsters of brass and iron, weighing upwards of 8,000 pounds. They were designed to be pulled by the strongest horses in the city, massive animals bred for explosive speed. When the fire alarm rang, these horses would rush from their stalls and stand under the suspended harnesses, ready to drag the pump to the blaze. Now, the stalls were full of heaving, coughing invalids. The fire commissioners issued a terrifying order: drag ropes. Long, thick hemp ropes were attached to the front axles of the steamers. When the alarm bell struck, the firefighters themselves, men already exhausted from double shifts, had to grab the ropes. It took 20 or 30 men to move a single engine. The citizens of New York watched with hearts in their throats as these human teams struggled to drag the apparatus through the streets. The response times tripled. Fires that should have been extinguished in minutes were allowed to burn for an hour because the engines simply couldn't get there fast enough. The city felt naked. Every wisp of smoke on the horizon caused a panic. The realization that the safety of 1 million people depended on the leg strength of a few dozen men was a sobering check on the city's arrogance. There were attempts to adapt the technology to the new reality. Inventors, sensing an opportunity, flooded the patent offices with designs for horseless vehicles. But these were dreams for the future. In the immediate present, the solutions were cruder. The streetcar companies, desperate to stem their losses, tried to hitch men to the trams, but the friction was too great. A streetcar, even empty, was a dead weight that defied human torque. They tried oxen, but the oxen were too slow and terrified of the city noise. They even briefly considered a fantastical plan to use steam locomotives on the street tracks, but the risk of explosion and the terror it would cause to pedestrians ruled it out. So, the streetcars sat rusting in the rain, a reminder of the limits of human muscle. By the beginning of November, the social fabric began to fray under the strain. The man-horse experiment was failing. It could move the light loads, the groceries, the mail, the coffins, but it could not move the heavy infrastructure of the city. The coal was not moving. The building materials were not moving. The garbage was not moving. The boxer and vixen humor began to evaporate. The men in the harnesses were no longer laughing. They were bruised, exhausted, and angry. The novelty of dragging a wagon down Fifth Avenue had turned into a symbol of degradation. The New York Tribune wrote editorials questioning the morality of the spectacle, asking if a society that treated its men like beasts deserved to call itself civilized. And yet, there was no choice. The horses remained sick. The cough in the stables had not abated. The veterinary reports were grim. The relapse rate was high. If a horse was worked too soon, it died. The only cure was time, weeks of it. Humanity had taken the yoke, but the yoke was too heavy. We were not designed for the collar. We were not engines. In the autumn of 1872, as the equine population of North America convulsed in fever, the human population turned its eyes towards science for salvation. They looked to the men in white coats, the learned scholars, the guardians of biological knowledge. They demanded a cure. They demanded a vaccine. They demanded an explanation. What they found instead was a terrifying emptiness. To understand the scale of the tragedy that unfolded in the stables of the United States, one must first confront the primitive, chaotic, and often brutal state of veterinary medicine in the late 19th century. In 1872, the germ theory of disease, the idea that invisible microorganisms cause illness, was still a radical, debated hypothesis. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were only just beginning to map the microbial world. For the average horse doctor in America, a virus
was a concept as alien as space travel. The profession itself barely existed. In the entire United States, a nation of nearly 40 million people and 7 million horses, there were fewer than 50 formally educated, degree-holding veterinarians. 50 men to treat a continent. The rest of the care was in the hands of a sprawling, unregulated army of empirics, farriers, stable grooms, and self-styled horse leeches. These were men who had learned their trade by apprenticeship or by trial and error. Their medical knowledge was a patchwork of folklore, medieval superstition, and brute force. They viewed the equine body not as a complex biological system, but as a stubborn engine that needed to be shocked back into operation. When the great Epizootic arrived, these men were the first line of defense. And in their ignorance, they became the agents of a massacre. The treatments unleashed upon the sick horses of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were a catalog of horrors. The prevailing medical philosophy of the time held that disease was an imbalance of the humors or a stagnation of the blood. Therefore, the logic went, the bad blood must be removed. Bleeding was the most common and most deadly intervention. A doctor would arrive at a stable where a horse stood shivering, its energy depleted by a fever of 106 degrees. The animal was already dehydrated, its heart racing to pump oxygen through congested lungs. The practitioner would then take a fleam or a lancet, open the jugular vein, and drain 2, 3, or 4 quarts of blood into a bucket. They believed this would lower the pulse and cool the fever. In reality, they were inducing hypovolemic shock. They were taking an animal that was fighting for its life and draining its battery. Thousands of horses that might have survived the influenza virus were killed by the loss of blood, collapsing on the straw not because of the pathogen, but because of the practitioner. But the bleeding was only the beginning. The pharmacological arsenal of 1872 was a chemist's nightmare. Because the horses were coughing and producing mucus, the empirics believed they needed to scour the system. They administered drenches, liquid mixtures poured forcibly down the throat of the animal. The ingredients of these drenches read like a witch's brew: turpentine, gin, vinegar, cayenne pepper, aconite, arsenic, and mercury. These caustic substances were poured into the inflamed, raw throats of animals already suffering from severe laryngitis.
The pain must have been excruciating. The turpentine burned the stomach lining. The heavy metals poisoned the kidneys. Many horses aspirated these mixtures into their lungs, leading to fatal gangrenous pneumonia. In the panicked atmosphere of October and November, quackery flourished. The newspapers were filled with advertisements for miracle cures and epizootic elixirs. Snake oil salesmen descended on the cities, peddling bottles of colored water laced
with opium or alcohol, promising instant relief for $1 a bottle. Desperate stable owners, watching their livelihoods wheeze and stumble, bought them by the crate. One popular remedy involved smoking the stables. The theory was that the disease was caused by a miasma, a cloud of bad air hanging over the city. To combat this, stable owners would seal the doors and windows of the barns and burn tar, feathers, leather, and sulfur inside. They believed the acrid smoke would disinfect the air. The result was a gas chamber. The horses, whose lungs were already filled with fluid and whose bronchial tubes were inflamed, were forced to breathe thick, toxic smoke. It was the equivalent of locking an asthmatic in a burning building to cure their asthma. The smoke irritated the respiratory tracts further, triggering violent paroxysms of coughing that could rupture the lungs. Amidst this carnival of ignorance, a small, beleaguered group of men tried to scream reason into the void. They were the pioneers of American veterinary science. Men like Dr. James Law of Cornell University and Dr. Alexander Lyotard of the New York College of Veterinary Surgeons. James Law was a Scotsman, educated in the rigorous veterinary schools of Europe. He was a man of science, a believer in observation and pathology. When the epizootic struck, Law was horrified by what he saw. He wrote frantic letters to the New York Tribune and the agricultural journals, pleading with owners to stop the treatments. Nature is the best physician, Law argued. His prescription was radical in its simplicity: rest, warmth, fresh air, clean water, soft food. Law understood that influenza was a self-limiting viral infection. The body would heal itself if given the chance. The danger was not the virus, but the secondary infections, pneumonia, pleurisy, bronchitis, that set in when the animal was weakened by work or bad medicine. Do not bleed, Law commanded. Do not purge. Do not irritate the throat with caustic mixtures. Blanket the animal to keep it warm. Ventilate the stable to remove the ammonia fumes. Feed them warm bran mashes, and above all, do not work them. Dr. Lyotard echoed this in New York City. He walked the stables of the streetcar companies, arguing with the foreman. He tried to explain that the miasma was not in the sky, but in the stable itself. The conditions of the urban stable were a public health disaster. In the basement stables of Manhattan, horses stood in stalls that had not been cleaned in days. The ammonia from the urine was so strong, it made human eyes water instantly. For a horse with a respiratory infection, breathing ammonia was a death sentence. It paralyzed the cilia in the windpipe, preventing the animal from clearing the mucus. Lyotard pleaded for ventilation. "Open the windows," he would shout. "Let the air move." But the old guard resisted. The cow doctors and the stable bosses believed that fresh air caused chills and that drafts were fatal. They kept the stables sealed tight, trapping the heat, the virus, and the ammonia in a deadly, humid box. The conflict between the new science and the old superstition played out in the mortality statistics. In stables managed by the old-school empirics, where horses were bled, smoked, and drenched, the mortality rate climbed to 10, sometimes 20%. In the stables that followed the advice of Law and Lyotard, where nursing and hygiene were prioritized, the mortality rate stayed below 2%.
It was a stark, statistical proof of the value of science, but it was a lesson learned too late for thousands of animals. The veterinary void also exposed a deep societal failing: the lack of legal protection for animals. While Henry Berg and the ASPCA could arrest a man for beating a horse on the street, they had little power to stop a doctor from bleeding a horse to death in a private stable. The law did not recognize malpractice against an animal. A horse was property, and a man could do what he wished with his property, even if it meant torturing it to death in a misguided attempt to save it. There were moments of grotesque tragedy. In Philadelphia, a rumor spread that placing a bag of onions around a horse's neck would draw out the fever. Thousands of horses stood in their stalls wearing necklaces of rotting vegetables. In Boston, a specialist recommended pouring kerosene into the ears. The horses bore it all with the stoic, silent endurance of their species. They stood in the dark, shivering under their blankets, their heads hanging low, while men burned tar around them and forced poison down their throats. But slowly, painfully, the truth began to penetrate the public consciousness. The sheer scale of the failure forced a reckoning. The owners who listened to the quacks saw their horses die. The owners who listened to Dr. Law saw their horses recover. Capitalism, in its cold efficiency, began to favor the science. By mid-November, the newspapers began to turn against the empirics. Editorials mocked the horse leeches and their medieval tortures. The American Agriculturist published a scathing attack on the ignorant pretenders who were killing the nation's stock. The Epizootic was becoming a crucible for the veterinary profession. It was exposing the frauds and elevating the scientists. Dr. James Law used the crisis to advocate for a national vision. He argued that the United States needed federal veterinary regulations. It needed a sanitary police force to monitor animal health. It needed universities to train real doctors. "We are a nation dependent on animals," Law wrote, "yet we treat their health with the superstition of savages." The Epizootic was the event that broke the dam. It proved, on a continental scale, that ignorance was expensive. It showed the railroad tycoons and the streetcar magnates that a single virus could destroy their balance sheets, and that their only defense was legitimate science. But in the dark days of November 1872, the reform was still in the future. The reality of the moment was a city of suffering. The silence of the streets was matched by the groans from the stables. The veterinary void had been revealed, and it was filled with the bodies of the innocent. As the epidemic moved toward its next great victim, the city of Boston, it would encounter a new enemy. Not just ignorance, but fire. The weakened state of the horses, combined with the flammable density of the urban environment, was about to create a catastrophe that would eclipse the flu itself. The red sky was coming. As the cold winds of November began to blow, carrying the first hints of winter snow, the men of the city looked at their blistered hands and their aching shoulders. They looked at the silent stables where their four-legged partners stood shivering in fever. And they realized, perhaps for the first time in history, the true weight of the world that the horse carried for them every single day. The city was a burden that only a giant could bear, and the giants were dying. The stage was set for the next phase of the disaster. As the physical strength of the city failed, the intellectual failure began to reveal itself. The people turned to their men of science, their doctors, and their experts, demanding a cure. They demanded to know why this was happening and how to stop it. But the veterinary void was deep. And what stared back from the abyss of 1872 medical science was not a cure, but a chaotic mixture of ignorance, quackery, and deadly incompetence. By the second week of November 1872, the great Epizootic had evolved from an economic crisis into a harbinger of physical destruction. The virus had moved north and east, striking the city of Boston with a virulence that rivaled the outbreak in New York. But in Boston, the timing of the plague would conspire with the architecture of the city and the whims of the wind to create a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Boston in 1872 was a city of pride and granite. It was the wealthy, intellectual hub of New England, rebuilt and modernized in the preceding decades with a sense of permanence. Its commercial district, centered around Summer and Washington streets, was lined with imposing 5- and 6-story warehouses filled with dry goods, wool, leather, and textiles. These buildings were crowned with the fashionable mansard roofs, steep wooden structures that added an extra floor of storage, but also acted, unfortunately, as perfect kindling. The Boston Fire Department was considered one of the best in the nation. It was a mechanized force, equipping itself with heavy steam pumpers and ladder trucks. But like every other fire department in the world, its motive power was biological. The heavy brass engines, weighing up to 8,000 pounds, were designed to be pulled by teams of massive, grain-fed horses. When the flu hit Boston in late October, it decimated the fire.
Stables. The symptoms were severe. The horses were spiking fevers, their legs were swelling, and they could barely stand, let alone run. On November 8th, the situation had become so dire that the Board of Fire Engineers made a fateful decision. In a gesture of mercy and veterinary necessity, they issued an order effectively standing down the horses. To work them was to kill them. The number of active horses in the department was reduced to a skeleton crew. For the vast majority of the engines, the motive power was switched to human muscle. The plan was simple, if desperate. Upon the sounding of an alarm, the firefighters, along with volunteers paid $1 for their labor, would seize drag ropes attached to the engines and pull them to the fire by hand. It was a regression to the early 19th century, a gamble that the city's brave men could substitute for its sick beasts. Saturday, November 9th, was a calm, crisp autumn day. The sun went down and the city quieted. The streets were largely empty, the usual clatter of Saturday night traffic silenced by the epidemic. The wind was blowing gently from the northwest. At approximately 7 p.m., in the basement of a dry goods warehouse at the corner of Summer and Kingston streets, a spark ignited. The cause remains a mystery, perhaps a boiler, perhaps a match, but the result was immediate. The fire climbed the wooden elevator shaft, feeding on the bales of dry goods. It punched through the roof and tasted the oxygen of the night air. At 7:24 p.m., the alarm was pulled at box 52. In a normal timeline, under normal conditions, the response would have been a thunderous display of speed. The alarm bells would ring in the firehouses. The suspended harnesses would drop onto the backs of the horses. The doors would fly open, and within 90 seconds, the first engines would be galloping down Summer Street, hooves striking sparks, arriving at the scene while the fire was still containable. But on this night, there was no galloping. When the bells rang in the engine houses, there was only the sound of men cursing and boots scraping on the floor. The firefighters, many of whom were already exhausted from weeks of extra labor,
grabbed the heavy hemp ropes. They leaned their weight against the mass of the steamers. The physics of the disaster were written in these first few minutes. An 8,000-pound steam engine has immense inertia. To get it moving requires a burst of torque that a horse provides naturally, but humans struggle to generate. The men strained, slipping on the cobblestones. Slowly, painfully, the wheels began to turn. The response was a slow-motion nightmare. Engine number 7, which should have arrived in minutes, took significantly longer. Other companies, coming from further away, arrived breathless and depleted, their arms trembling from the exertion of the drag. Those lost minutes were the difference between an incident and a calamity. By the time the first stream of water hit the building on Summer Street, the fire had already crowned. It had leaped from the elevator shaft to the mansard roof. The heat was already intense enough to crack the granite facades of the neighboring buildings. And here, the lack of horses compounded the tragedy. The fire department relied on coal to keep the steam engines pumping water. Usually, coal wagons pulled by horses would circulate among the engines, keeping their fireboxes fed. But there were no coal wagons. The supply chain of the firefight was broken. As the fire grew, it created its own weather system. The red sky began to glow over Boston, visible for miles at sea. The heat became a physical wall, pushing the firefighters back. The wind caught the embers and hurled them onto the wooden roofs of the adjacent blocks. The granite buildings, thought to be fireproof, crumbled as the intense heat caused the stone to expand and shatter. The fire chief, John Damrell, realized he was losing the city. He needed more power. He needed speed. He sent out a desperate order. "Bring out the horses, sick or not." It was a tragic command. In the stables, the sick, shivering animals were roused from their straw. Their eyes were glazed, their breathing ragged. They were hitched to the reserve engines and the coal wagons. Witnesses described heartbreaking scenes. Horses, coughing violently, were whipped into the inferno. They strained against the collars, their instinct to serve overriding their biological collapse. Some dropped dead in the streets, their hearts bursting from the strain. Others stood amidst the falling sparks, wheezing, too weak to shy away from the heat. But it was too late. The fire had outrun the response time. It jumped Washington Street. It consumed the publishing houses, the newspaper offices, the banks, and the wool warehouses. It was eating the wealth of New England. The man-horse teams continued to fight. Citizens poured out of the saloons and houses to grab the ropes. There were reports of frantic mobs dragging engines down the wrong streets, of collisions, of chaos. Without the discipline and speed of the horses, the coordination of the department disintegrated. The telegraph lines carried the news to the world. Boston is burning. In the surrounding towns, Cambridge, Charlestown, Watertown, the fire companies saw the glow and mobilized to help. But they too were crippled by the Epizootic. They had to drag their engines for miles by hand. By the time they reached the city limits, the men were physically shattered, unable to effectively man the hoses. The fire raged for 12 hours. It created a firestorm, a vortex of superheated air that melted iron lampposts and turned glass into puddles on the sidewalk. It was a demon that devoured 65 acres of the most valuable real estate in America. When the sun rose on Sunday morning, the heart of Boston was a smoking crater. 776 buildings were destroyed. The financial loss was estimated at $75 million,
a staggering sum in 1872, equivalent to billions today. The aftermath brought a somber realization. The Great Boston Fire was not just an accident. It was a consequence. It was the brutal receipt for a society that had built its safety on a single, vulnerable biological foundation. In the days following the fire, amidst the smoking ruins, the carcass of a horse would occasionally be found, still harnessed to a piece of equipment, a silent casualty of the desperate attempt to save the city. These ghost horses became symbols of the disaster. The inquiry that followed was scathing. The fire commissioners were grilled. Why were the engines late? Why was the water pressure low? The answer always came back to the flue. The delay in the first 15 minutes, the time lost dragging the engines by hand, had allowed the fire to escape containment. If the horses had been healthy, if the response had been instantaneous, the fire might have been confined to the corner of Summer and Kingston. The Epizootic had not struck the match, but it had stripped the city of its armor. The psychological impact on the nation was profound. New York had been silenced, but Boston had been immolated. The connection between the sickness of the beast and the survival of the civilization was now undeniable. A coughing horse was not just a logistics problem, it was a threat to national security. The red sky of Boston served as a grim lighthouse, warning the rest of the country of the dangers of the coming winter. The economy was seizing up. The coal was not moving. The food was rotting. And now the cities were burning. As the smoke cleared over Boston Harbor, the Epizootic continued its relentless march. It moved west toward the Great Plains. It moved south toward the recovering cities of the former Confederacy. And it moved toward a new kind of crisis. The winter of 1872 was approaching. The coal shortage, foreshadowed in New York and exacerbated by the disruption in Boston, was about to become a matter of life and death for millions. The fire had burned the buildings, but the cold was coming for the people. The chain reaction of the economic seizure was about to begin. The banks were trembling, the railroads were clogged, and the horse, the silent patient at the center of the storm, continued to cough. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of Boston in mid-November 1872, a colder, quieter reality settled over the North American continent. The spectacle of the fire had been shocking, a violent visual climax to the epidemic, but what followed was a slow, grinding asphyxiation of the economy. The Great Epizootic was no longer just a veterinary crisis or a public safety hazard. It had metastasized into a full-scale commercial depression. The chain reaction began with the weather. The autumn of 1872 was turning unseasonably cold. In the northern latitudes of the United States and Canada, the first frosts were hardening the ground, and the gray skies promised an early winter. In the 19th century, heat was not a utility piped into homes via gas or electricity. It was a physical commodity. It was coal. The United States ran on anthracite. The black stones from the mines of Pennsylvania were the lifeblood of the nation, heating the tenement slums of New York, powering the steam engines of the New England textile mills, and fueling the stoves of the Midwestern farmhouses. The supply chain for this vital resource was robust, built on a network of canals and railroads that could move millions of tons from the pithead to the city depot.
But the chain broke at the last link. By late November, the coal depots of the major cities were overflowing. The trains continued to arrive, dumping their black mountains in the rail yards of Jersey City, Philadelphia, and Chicago. But the distribution network, the thousands of horse-drawn carts that moved the coal from the yard to the cellar, had vanished. The result was the Great Coal Panic of 1872. It was a crisis of accessibility, not scarcity. The fuel was there, visible, tangible, piled high behind the fences of the rail yards. But for the average family living 3 miles away, it might as well have been on the moon. The price of coal delivered to the home doubled, then tripled. For the wealthy, this was an annoyance. For the working poor, it was a catastrophe. In the tenements of the Lower East Side and the shanties of South Boston, families began to burn furniture, fences, and trash to stay warm. The shadow inflation, caused by the horse flu, attacked the most vulnerable first. The paralysis of the coal trade sent shockwaves upstream. With the depots full, the orders to the mines were canceled. In the coal regions of Pennsylvania, miners were laid off, not because there was no coal to dig, but because there was nowhere to put it. The stopping power of the virus was revealing the exquisite, fragile interdependence of the industrial economy. A sneezing horse in Brooklyn could starve a miner in Scranton. Simultaneously, the food supply began to seize. The 19th century city relied on a daily influx of perishable goods. Milk, vegetables, and meat had to move fast. There was no mechanical refrigeration. Speed was the only preservative. The milk famine hit the cities first. Dairy farmers in the surrounding counties found themselves unable to move their churns to the train stations. Even when the milk made it to the city depots, the urban delivery wagons were grounded. Thousands of gallons of milk soured on the platforms, while infants in the city cried for it. The price of fresh milk skyrocketed, forcing the poor to rely on swill milk, a dangerous, adulterated product produced by cows kept in city distillery basements, often leading to outbreaks of tuberculosis and other diseases. In the markets, the scene was one of waste amidst want. Produce rotted in the stalls because grocers couldn't make deliveries to
restaurants or homes. The intricate dance of the wholesale markets, Fulton Fish Market in New York, Faneuil Hall in Boston, slowed to a crawl. The cost of living surged. A barrel of flour, a bushel of potatoes, a side of beef. Every commodity carried a horse tax, a premium added to cover the exorbitant cost of finding alternative transport. The friction on the economy became unbearable for small businesses. The Great Epizootic was an extinction event for the little man. The large express companies and the wealthy merchants had the capital to weather the storm. They could afford to hire human teams or pay extortionate rates for the few remaining healthy oxen. But the independent carter, the small livery stable owner, the local baker, they were wiped out. Thousands of small businesses declared bankruptcy in the winter of 1872. A livery stable owner whose entire stock was sick still had to buy feed, pay rent, and pay wages, all while earning zero revenue. The debt accumulated in weeks was enough to destroy livelihoods built over decades. This wave of failures destabilized the banking sector. The small businessmen defaulted on their loans. The local banks, finding themselves holding worthless paper and liens on sick horses, began to tighten their credit. The flow of money, like the flow of goods, began to coagulate. Historians and economists have often debated the causes of the Panic of 1873, the massive financial crash that would trigger the Long Depression the following year.
While the crash had many parents, railroad speculation, the demonetization of silver, the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, the Epizootic of 1872 is the overlooked precipitant. The virus softened the ground. It weakened the corporate balance sheets just before the storm hit. It drained the cash reserves of the railroads and the transit companies. It created a psychological climate of pessimism. The animal engine had faltered, and the confidence of the investors faltered with it. The paralysis also affected the construction industry. The building boom that had defined the post-Civil War era came to a screeching halt. Bricks, lumber, and steel beams are heavy. They require immense torque to move. Without horses, construction sites fell silent. The skeletons of half-finished buildings stood against the gray sky, monuments to the limits of human ambition. In the manufacturing districts, factories began to close, not because their machinery was broken, but because their warehouses were full. A textile mill in Lowell could produce thousands of yards of cloth a day, but if it couldn't ship the finished product to the retailer, it had to stop production. The inventory glut forced layoffs. Thousands of factory workers joined the unemployed dock workers and teamsters on the streets, creating a volatile social mixture. The cultural impact of the economic seizure was profound. It forced a society that worshipped progress to confront its own primitive foundations. The Americans of 1872 believed they were living in the age of the machine. They marveled at the telegraph and the steamship, but the flu proved that their modern life was a facade. Beneath the veneer of steam and iron, they were still an agrarian society masquerading as an industrial one. They were still dependent on the weather, the harvest, and the health of their beasts. The newspapers of the time reflected a growing existential dread. Editorials moved from mocking the man-horse teams to questioning the future of the nation. "Are we to be defeated by a microbe?" asked the Chicago Tribune. "Is the prowess of the American Republic so frail that it cannot withstand a cough?" As December approached, the chain reaction moved west. The virus, traveling on the very railroads that were hemorrhaging money, reached Chicago, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. These were the gateway cities to the American West, the hubs of the agricultural trade. The threat to the West was different and perhaps even more terrifying. In the East, the horse was a mover of goods. In the West, the horse was a maker of food. If the virus reached the farm horses during the harvest or the planting season, it wouldn't just mean a coal shortage, it would mean famine. The agricultural societies sounded the alarm. They urged farmers to quarantine their stock, to stop bringing horses into town. But the economic pressure to sell crops was too strong. The farmers came to the markets, and the horses touched noses. The Epizootic was now a continental siege. It held the mines of Pennsylvania, the ports of New England, the factories of the Midwest, and the farms of the plains in its grip. The estimated daily loss to the U.S. economy was calculated in the millions of dollars, an astronomical sum for the time. And yet, amidst the economic carnage, a strange resilience emerged. The black market for transportation boomed. Handcarts, wheelbarrows, and dog carts became valuable assets. The pedestrian city became a reality, with people walking 5, 10, 12 miles to work.
The breakdown of the system forced a localization of life. Neighborhoods became self-sufficient villages again. But as the snow began to fall in earnest in December 1872, covering the silent streets and the frozen manure, the nation was tired. It was impoverished. It was cold. The chain reaction had exposed the hidden costs of the 19th century logistics model. It demonstrated that a transportation monopoly, even a biological one, was a fatal weakness. The seed was planted in the minds of engineers and inventors. We must break the bond. We must find a way to move that does not breathe, does not bleed, and does not catch the flu. The stage was set for the final frontier of the epidemic. The virus was heading toward the edge of civilization, toward the cavalry forts and the Indian Wars, toward the raw, untamed potential of the American West. The Western Front was about to open. As the great Epizootic of 1872 tightened its grip on the eastern seaboard, the virus began to look west. It did not travel as a pioneer, struggling against the elements. It traveled as a passenger of the Gilded Age, riding the iron rails that had only recently conquered the continent. The psychological impact of the epidemic's arrival in Chicago was distinct from the panic in New York or the tragedy in Boston. Chicago in 1872 was a city of trauma. Only 12 months earlier, the Great Fire of 1871 had reduced the metropolis to a charred skeleton. The city was in the midst of a frantic, miraculous reconstruction. It was the Phoenix City, rising from the ashes with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. But reconstruction is heavy work. It requires stone, lumber, iron, and glass. And in 1872, the only way to move the materials of a new city was by horse. When the flu arrived in the rail yards of Chicago in late October, it found a population that was already pushed to its physical limit. The horses of Chicago were the heroes of the rebuild. They had hauled the millions of tons of debris out of the ruins. They had dragged the beams for the new skyscrapers. They were overworked, living in temporary, drafty stables erected hastily amidst the construction zones. They were tired before the virus even touched them. The collapse of Chicago's motive power was brutal and immediate. The famous Chicago mud, a slurry of black soil and lake water that could swallow a wagon wheel to the axle, made the man-horse solution impossible. In New York, men could drag a cart over paved cobblestones. In Chicago, a man trying to pull a wagon sank into the muck. The city didn't just slow down, it stuck fast. The suspension of the streetcars in Chicago paralyzed the labor force needed for the rebuilding efforts. Carpenters couldn't get to the sites. Masons couldn't get their stone. The clanging hammers of the reconstruction fell silent, a ghostly echo of the silence in the east. For a city desperate to prove it was alive, this second stillness was a terrifying blow to morale. But Chicago was merely the gateway. Beyond the stockyards and the grain elevators lay the true vulnerability of the American nation, the heartland. As the virus moved out of the cities and into the vast agricultural expanses of Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri, the nature of the threat changed. In the city, the horse was a vector of commerce. In the country, the horse was the engine of survival. The timing of the epidemic was a stroke of bitter luck. It was November. The harvest was largely in, the corn and wheat severed from the earth. But the harvest is useless if it sits in the barn. The crops needed to be moved to the railheads to feed the hungry cities of the East and the markets of Europe. The corn blockade of 1872 became a silent crisis of the plains. Farmers stood in their doorways, looking at cribs bursting with corn, while their teams stood shivering in the barn. They couldn't haul the grain to the elevator. the entire agricultural supply chain backed up. The price of corn plummeted in the West because of the glut, while the price of corn skyrocketed in the East because of the scarcity. It was an economic paradox created by the failure of transport. The isolation of the rural family during the Epizootic was profound. In the pre-automobile era, the horse was the only connection to the outside world. Without a horse, a farm was an island. If a child fell sick, the doctor could not be fetched. If the firewood ran low, it could not be hauled from the woodlot. The social distance of the prairie, usually spanning miles, became an impassable chasm. The epidemic also posed a terrifying question. What if it jumps to the other stock? The fear of zoonosis, of the disease leaping from horses to cattle or pigs, haunted the agricultural journals. While the influenza was specific to equines, the 19th century farmer lived in fear of murrain, or plague. A disease that wiped out the cattle herds would mean starvation. Thankfully, the barrier held, but the anxiety added to the dark atmosphere of the winter. Further west, the virus began to intersect with the geopolitical struggles of the continent. The United States Army was engaged in a low-intensity, high-stakes conflict across the Great Plains and the Southwest, the Indian Wars. The U.S. cavalry was the projection of federal power in the West, but a cavalryman without a horse is just a man in boots walking through a desert. The Army relied on a complex logistics tale, wagon trains of supplies pulled by mules, bringing ammunition, food, and fodder to the remote forts. The Epizootic moved along the supply lines. It struck the quartermaster depots in St. Louis and Leavenworth. It hit the mule trains plodding toward the frontier. Reports from the forts paint a picture of strategic paralysis. In the Arizona Territory, where General George Crook was conducting campaigns against the Apache, the sickness of the animals threatened to halt operations. A sick mule meant no water delivery. A sick cavalry mount meant the patrols stopped. The hostiles, as the Army termed the Native American resistance, were not subject to the same logistical constraints in the same way. Their ponies, often living in smaller, isolated bands and grass-fed, were sometimes less affected by the dense, stable-spread contagion of the white man's stock. There was a genuine fear in Washington that the Epizootic would tip the balance of power on the frontier. If the Army could not move, the forts were vulnerable. The siege by virus threatened to undo the tenuous hold the government had on the territories. However, the biology of the plains offered a strange mercy. The sheer distance between settlements acted as a firebreak. Unlike the East, where stables were contiguous, a ranch in Nebraska might be 20 miles from its neighbor. The virus struggled to jump these gaps. It moved slower, hitchhiking only on the
sporadic stagecoaches and mail wagons. This slowed the advance, but it did not stop it. The Wells Fargo stages began to miss their schedules. The overland mail was delayed. The tenuous threads binding California to the rest of the Union began to fray. In the mining camps of Colorado and Nevada, the impact was severe. These were communities that existed solely to extract ore. They imported everything: food, timber, machinery, up steep mountain roads that only mule teams could navigate. When the mules got sick, the mines shut down. The stamp mills went quiet. The boom towns threatened to bust overnight. The western front of the Epizootic was a battle against space. It revealed the terrifying vastness of the American continent. Without the animal engine to shrink the distance, the miles expanded back to their original daunting scale. A 10-mile trip to town, once a morning's errand, became a day-long, exhausting trek on foot through freezing mud.
As the winter deepened, reports began to filter back of the great die-off in the transit camps. Mules and horses, forced to work until they dropped by desperate teamsters trying to beat the snows, were dying by the roadside. Their carcasses were left to the wolves and the coyotes, grim mile markers on the road to the Pacific. There was also a cultural shift occurring in the West. The cowboy, the teamster, the stage driver. These were men whose identity was fused with their animals. To see their partners reduced to shivering, snot-nosed invalids was a blow to their masculinity and their way of life. It was a humbling reminder that for all their rugged individualism, they were utterly dependent on a four-legged creature. By the end of 1872, the Epizootic had not yet fully reached the Pacific coast. That would come in the spring of 1873. But it had effectively severed the West from the East. The flow of goods, mail, and people had coagulated. The United States, which had celebrated the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad as the end of isolation, found that the railroad alone was not enough. The train could cross the continent, but it couldn't cross the street. It couldn't climb the mountain trail to the mine. It couldn't cross the cornfield. The western front of the flu demonstrated the last mile problem on a continental scale. It proved that the industrial infrastructure was an archipelago of islands, connected by steam, but surrounded by a sea of mud that only a horse could navigate. As the year turned, the nation was battered, broke, and immobile. But the crisis was not just economic and logistical. It was political. The paralysis had occurred during a presidential election. It had occurred during a time of immense corruption and scandal in the Grant administration. The people, freezing in their homes without coal, unable to travel, and watching their livelihoods rot, began to look for someone to blame. They looked at the government. They looked at the city bosses. They
looked at the rings of power. The Epizootic had politicized the horse. And as the country moved toward the inauguration of 1873, the sick animal became a symbol of a sick body politic. The political animal was about to take the stage, and the satire would be as biting as the winter wind. The cartoonists were sharpening their pencils. Histories is rarely considerate enough to schedule its crises one at a time. In the autumn of 1872, the United States was not only facing a biological collapse, it was embroiled in one of the most vicious, chaotic, and tragic presidential elections in its history. The Great Epizootic did not just paralyze commerce, it crashed headlong into the machinery of American democracy. The contest of 1872 was a battle between the incumbent, Ulysses S. Grant, the stoic hero of the Civil War, and Horace Greeley, the eccentric, wild-haired editor of the New York Tribune. It was a campaign defined by mudslinging, Reconstruction politics, and the brewing storms of corruption scandals like the Crédit Mobilier. But as November approached, the campaign lost its voice. 19th century politics was a contact sport. It relied on physical spectacle. The primary engine of a campaign was the torchlight parade. In every town and city, thousands of partisans would march through the streets at night, carrying kerosene torches, pulling floats, and chanting slogans. These processions were massive logistical operations that required, inevitably, horses. Horses to pull the floats, horses to carry the grand marshals, horses to drag the bandwagons. In late October,
As the flu silenced the cities of the North, the lights went out on the campaign. The Republican and Liberal Republican committees were forced to issue unprecedented cancellation notices. "No parades," the broadsides read. "Our horses are sick." The grand spectacles that were supposed to rally the base in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were scrapped. The bands played on street corners, standing still, because there were no teams to pull them. The candidates, unable to travel easily by carriage from the train stations to the rallies, found themselves stranded. The silence of the streets seeped into the political discourse. The usual roar of the election season was replaced by a strange, muted anxiety. It was difficult to whip up fervor about tariffs or amnesty when the voters were freezing in their homes and worried about their livelihoods. Election Day was Tuesday, November 5th, 1872. It fell precisely during the peak of the epidemic in the Northeast. The logistics of voting in 1872 were not simple. Polling places were often miles away, especially in rural counties. In the cities, the political machines, Tammany Hall in New York, the Republican rings in Philadelphia, relied on fleets of carriages to get out the vote. They would round up voters from the tenements and saloons, pile them into wagons, and shuttle them to the polls. On November 5th, the wagons
were grounded. The result was a profound disruption of the democratic ritual. Historical accounts describe pedestrian elections. Voters trudged miles through the cold rain to cast their ballots. The elderly and the infirm, unable to walk the distance and unable to hire a cab, stayed home. While Grant won a decisive victory, winning 31 of 37 states, the horseflu election remains a unique anomaly, the only time in American history that a pathogen explicitly grounded the transportation network of the electorate. But the epizootic did more than just disrupt the logistics. It provided a potent metaphor for the satirists. Thomas Nast, the legendary cartoonist for Harper's Weekly, the man who gave us the Republican elephant and the modern image of Santa Claus, saw the flu as a gift. Nast was a fierce critic of the corruption that was festering in the Grant administration and the city governments. To Nast and his contemporaries, the sick horse became a symbol of the sick state. Cartoons began to appear depicting the U.S. government as a broken-down, wheezing nag, overloaded with the baggage of scandal, nepotism, and greed. The epizootic of corruption became a headline. One striking cartoon depicted a horse labeled the public service, collapsing under the weight of fat, corrupt politicians. The caption asked, "Who will pull the wagon now?" It was a biting critique of a system that rode its workers and its animals to death. The tragedy of Horace Greeley mirrored the tragedy of the streets. Greeley, who had spent his life advocating for the humane treatment of animals and the progress of the nation, was crushed at the polls. He lost his wife to illness just days before the election. He lost his mind shortly after. He died on November 29, 1872, before the Electoral College even met to formalize his defeat. His funeral procession in New York was one of the first major events where the horses were beginning to return to the streets. A somber, slow-moving parade of recovering animals pulling the hearse of a broken man. As the winter turned into the spring of 1873, the political calendar moved toward the inauguration. March 4th, 1873, was one of the coldest days on record in Washington, D.C. The wind howled down Pennsylvania Avenue, freezing the bunting and the flags. The epizootic had largely passed through the capital, but the horse population remained weak. The inaugural parade, usually a display of military might and pomp, was a grim affair. Many of the cavalry units, their mounts still recovering from the distemper, could not participate.
The West Point cadets marched without their usual equestrian support. The grandstands were filled with shivering spectators who had walked to the parade route because cabs were still scarce and exorbitantly expensive. President Grant, wrapped in a heavy overcoat, reviewed a nation that was physically and psychologically exhausted. The Gilded Age was losing its shine. The optimism of the
Post-war boom was evaporating. The Epizootic had exposed the fragility of the political infrastructure. It showed that the government's power to project authority, to move troops, to deliver mail, to hold elections, was contingent on the health of a biological host. The ship of state was actually a wagon, and the wagon was stuck in the mud. In the halls of Congress, the crisis spurred a quiet but significant shift. The veterinary void that had been exposed by the flu began to attract legislative attention. If the economy and the military could be paralyzed by a sneeze, then perhaps the health of animals was a matter of federal interest. The seed was planted for the creation of the Bureau of Animal Industry, which would be founded in 1884. The Epizootic transformed the horse from a piece of private property into a public utility. It forced the government to realize that in a biological network, the health of the individual is the health of the whole. But in the spring of 1873, these reforms were still distant. The immediate reality was a nation entering a period of darkness. The Panic of 1873 was on the horizon, a financial depression that would last for years. The Epizootic had been the prologue, the opening act that weakened the patient before the economic fever set in. The political animal had survived the flu, but it was left scarred, cynical, and wary. The laughter at the man-horse teams had died away. The cartoons of sick horses had stopped being funny and started looking like accurate portraits of the national condition. And as the snow melted and the cities began to thaw, a new anxiety took hold. The horses were recovering, yes. The silence was breaking. The roar of the streets was returning. But the people had looked into the abyss. They had seen a world without movement, and they began to ask the question that would define the next generation of inventors. Is there a better way? The Epizootic didn't invent the internal combustion engine. It didn't invent the electric motor, but it created the desire for them. It created a market that was desperate for a machine that didn't get sick. The human question was about to be asked, not how do we cure the horse, but how do we replace him? But before the replacement, there was the reckoning. The death toll had to be counted. The winter had been hard, and the spring revealed what had been buried under the snow. The silence did not last forever. It ended as it had begun, not with a shout, but with a cough that slowly cleared. By the early months of 1873, the fever that had gripped the continent began to break. The viral storm, having consumed nearly every susceptible host from Ontario to the Gulf of Mexico, burned itself out for lack of fuel. In the dark, ammonia-scented stables of New York and Boston, the heavy breathing of the draft horses quieted. The discharge cleared from their nostrils. The light returned to their eyes. The Great Return was a gradual, tentative process. It began with the private carriages, the well-fed teams of the wealthy venturing back onto Fifth Avenue. Then came the delivery wagons, the grocers and the butchers, tentatively hitching up their survivors. And finally, with a groan of iron and wood, the streetcars resumed their endless circles. When the full roar of the city returned,
that deafening, chaotic symphony of hooves on cobblestones. It was greeted with a strange mixture of relief and celebration. Newspapers called it a jubilee. Citizens lined the streets to cheer the first horse-drawn trams as if they were returning heroes. The economy, which had been suffering a slow asphyxiation, took a deep, shuddering breath and came back to life. The coal moved, the milk arrived, the mail was delivered. But the world that the horses returned to was not the same world they had left in October. The Epizootic had broken something fundamental in the psyche of the 19th century. It had shattered the illusion of stability. For thousands of years, humanity had viewed the horse as an eternal constant, a biological fact of life as reliable as the tides. The Epizootic of 1872 proved that the horse was a single point of failure. The civilization of the Gilded Age, with its telegraphs and its steamships and its soaring ambitions, realized with a shock of terror that it was standing on a trapdoor. The immediate legacy of the disaster was institutional. The carnage of the veterinary void could not be ignored. The sight of quacks bleeding horses to death and burning stables with sulfur had shamed the nation. In the years following the plague, the United States finally began to professionalize the care of animals. The veterinary schools that Dr. James Law and Dr. Alexander Lyotard had dreamed of began to find funding and respect. The horse doctor evolved from a stable hand with a knife into a man of science. In 1884, largely as a consequence of the vulnerabilities exposed by the Epizootic and subsequent livestock scares, the federal government established the Bureau of Animal Industry. It was the first time Washington officially recognized that the health of the nation's animals was a matter of national security. But the deeper legacy was technological. The Epizootic acted as a massive, traumatic acceleration event for innovation. During those dark weeks of silence, while the cities were paralyzed, a generation of inventors and engineers had looked out their windows and seen the problem clearly. They saw a transportation system that was biological, temperamental, susceptible to disease, and limited by fatigue. They saw the man-horse teams struggling in the harnesses and realized the indignity and inefficiency of muscle power. The desire for a horseless city moved from the realm of fantasy to the realm of urgent economic necessity. The Epizootic did not invent the electric motor or the internal combustion engine, but it created the market for them. It shifted the
Question from, can we build it, to, how soon can we have it? The first victim of this shift was the urban streetcar horse. The transit barons, the men who owned the Third Avenue line and the metropolitan networks, had lost millions of dollars during the flu. They swore they would never be held hostage by a microbe again. They poured capital into alternatives. They experimented with cable cars, which enjoyed a brief boom in cities like San Francisco and Chicago. They flirted with steam trams. But the true answer arrived in the 1880s with the work of Frank Sprague and the electric trolley. When the electric streetcar finally arrived, sweeping through American cities with its copper wires and its humming motors, it was framed as a liberation. It was clean. It was tireless. It did not eat oats when it wasn't working. And, most importantly, it did not catch the flu. The decline of the horse was not immediate.
It would take another 50 years for the automobile to fully replace the dray horse. But the Epizootic of 1872 was the beginning of the end. It was the high watermark of the horse age, the moment when the dependency was absolute and the consequences were catastrophic. After 1872, the trajectory was one of slow, steady replacement. There is a profound melancholy in this transition. The horse had built the world. It had cleared the forests, plowed the prairies, hauled the stone for the cathedrals and the iron for the railways. It had carried men into battle and carried them to their graves. It had suffered with us, bled with us, and died for us. And in 1872, when it faltered, when it asked for a moment of rest, we realized we couldn't afford it. And so, we invented its replacement. Today, if you walk the streets of New York or Boston, the great Epizootic is entirely forgotten. The cobblestones have been paved over with asphalt. The stables have been converted into luxury apartments or garages. The roar of the hooves has been replaced by the drone of tires and the hum of engines. But if you listen closely to the history of the American city, you can still hear the echo of that strange, silent autumn. You can hear the ghost of a civilization that stopped. The Great Horse Flu of 1872 was a tragedy, yes, but it was also the birth pang of the modern world. It was the moment we decided to sever our bond with the animal kingdom and embrace the machine. We traded the breath of the living for the spark of the engine. We gained speed. We gained reliability. We gained a world that never sleeps and never gets sick. But in the quiet corners of our history, the horse still stands, head low, breath steaming in the cold air, waiting for us to remember that before we had engines, we had partners,